The sound of obsidian striking obsidian is sharp, but the silence that followed it was suffocating. Inside the obsidian hall, the night court's most sacred chamber, 200 immortals stopped breathing. Lord Valerian Nocturne, a vampire who had ruled for 3 centuries and destroyed bloodlines before dawn, had just raised his voice at a human waitress. Everyone expected her to tremble. Everyone expected her to beg. Instead, Lena Cross set down the decanter, looked the vampire king in his ancient eyes, and spoke 7 words that would shatter an empire built on fear. Raise your voice again, and this is over. What Valerian did next didn't just shock the court, it terrified them. You are not going to believe how this night ends. Thank you for joining me in the Obsidian Hall tonight. If you're already captivated by Lena's courage and curious about how a single sentence can topple an empire, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another story of power, defiance, and the kind of courage that changes kingdoms. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Now, let's step into the night where everything changed. The storm outside the Obsidian Hall that night was unrelenting, winds howling through the mountain passes like the screams of forgotten souls. Inside, the air smelled of blood wine, centuries-old stone, and the metallic tang of suppressed violence. Lena Cross adjusted the silver tray balanced against her hip, her feet aching in shoes that had seen too many double shifts. The hem of her plain brown uniform brushed against her ankles as she moved between tables of silk-clad nobles who never looked at her face. It was her 3rd night serving in the Great Hall, and the coin she earned barely covered the rent on the servants' quarters in the outer city. She was exhausted, but her expression remained carefully neutral, professional indifference perfected over years of surviving in spaces where she didn't belong. Table 7 needs more blood wine, Charles, the head steward, hissed as he passed her near the kitchens. His face was pale even by vampire standards. And be careful. Lord Valerian is negotiating with Darius Blackthorn tonight. The king is tense. Lena didn't need the warning. Everyone in the realm knew who Lord Valerian Nocturne was. At over 300 years old, he was the architect of the modern night court, a ruler who had unified warring vampire houses through strategic brilliance and ruthless displays of dominance. He was striking in the way a blade is striking, sharp-featured, silver-white hair pulled back from a face that could have been carved from marble, eyes the color of storm-forged steel. But tonight, seated at the obsidian high table, he looked like a king on the edge of violence barely contained. He sat with 2 others. One was Marcus, his chief advisor, a nervous, thin vampire who kept dabbing his forehead with a cloth despite the hall's cool temperature. The other was Darius Blackthorn, Valerian's greatest rival. Darius was broader, older in appearance, with dark hair and a smile that suggested he knew secrets worth kingdoms. He lounged in his chair like a wolf watching prey stumble. Lena approached the high table with a blood wine decanter, its crystal surface cold against her palm. "I'm telling you, Valerian," Darius was saying, his voice carrying the lazy confidence of someone who believed he'd already won. "The Eastern Accord is collapsing. Lord Marin's house is drowning in debt from the border wars. If you press him now, you'll look like a tyrant and lose the allegiance of the coastal houses." Valerian's hand came down hard on the table. The obsidian surface rang like a bell. Goblets rattled. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. "Don't lecture me about perception, Darius," Valerian said, his voice sharp and cold. "You're trying to undermine the Accord because you want the coastal trade routes for yourself." "I'm trying to save you from a political disaster," Darius replied smoothly. His smile widened. "But by all means, continue alienating your allies." Lena moved silently to Valerian's right side to pour the blood wine. She had done this hundreds of times before. Approach from the side, pour smoothly, catch the final drop with a twist of the wrist, retreat. The motion was practiced, precise. But just as she began to tilt the decanter, Valerian threw his arm out in a sharp gesture of frustration toward Darius. His forearm struck Lena's wrist with immortal strength. The decanter didn't fall. She caught it against her chest, but blood wine sloshed violently over the rim, splashing across the sleeve of Valerian's midnight blue coat. Dark droplets stained the silver embroidery like wounds. The reaction was instantaneous. Valerian rose from his throne-like chair, the sound of stone scraping against stone echoing through the vaulted ceiling. His eyes blazed. "Do you have any comprehension," he said, his voice rising to fill the hall like thunder, "of what is at stake tonight?" He wasn't just addressing Lena. He was venting centuries of pressure, political strain, and the weight of rivals circling like carrion birds. "I am negotiating the future of 3 bloodlines, and I have to suffer incompetence from." He stopped himself before saying mortals, but the word hung in the air anyway. The entire hall went silent. Nobles froze mid-conversation. At table 12, an emissary from the southern court looked away nervously. At table 4, a merchant prince's eyes went wide with fascination. This was the kind of public spectacle that would be whispered about for decades. Charles rushed forward, wringing his hands, his voice a panicked whisper. "My lord, I am profoundly sorry. She's new to the high table. It won't happen." "I don't care if she's new," Valerian snapped, his storm-gray eyes locked on Lena. He towered over her, immortal and absolute. "I am in the middle of preventing a civil war, and I am forced to endure." He gestured at the stain on his coat.
Leave. Now."
"Before I..." Darius Blackthorne let out a low, mocking laugh. "Rough negotiations, Valerian? Can't even control your own servants." That laugh did it. Something inside Lena shifted. It wasn't the insult. It wasn't even the raised voice. It was the arrogance, the bone-deep assumption that because he had power and immortality and centuries, she was nothing, a thing, an inconvenience. She thought of her grandmother, who had died in service to a vampire house that never learned her name. She thought of every mortal servant who had bowed and trembled and disappeared into history without a trace. Lena didn't retreat. She didn't apologize again. She stepped forward. She set the bloodwine decanter on the obsidian table with a soft, definitive sound. In the frozen silence, it echoed like a judge's gavel. Then Lena looked up. She met Lord Valerian Nocturne's eyes that had watched empires rise and fall, and she didn't blink. She didn't tremble. "I didn't spill the wine, my lord," she said. Her voice was low, steady, and impossibly clear in the breathless quiet. "You struck my arm because you're losing control of this negotiation." Charles made a strangled sound. "Lena, leave immediately." Lena ignored him. She kept her gaze locked on Valerian. "You are trying to secure the Eastern Accord while Darius Blackthorne undermines you at every turn. You're stressed because he's baiting you, and you're falling for it." She paused. "But you do not take that out on me." Valerian stared at her. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. In 3 centuries, no one had ever spoken to him like this. Not his rivals. Not his council. And certainly not a mortal servant. Lena leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper that only the 3 men at the high table could hear. The hall strained to listen, but her words were for the king alone. "Raise your voice again, and this is over." Valerian blinked, his brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" "This feast," Lena said, her tone measured, deliberate. "I walk away. Charles calls the guard. You create a scene. And Lord Blackthorne here," she glanced at Darius, whose smirk had frozen on his face, returns to his allies and tells them that Lord Valerian Nocturne is so unstable he screamed at a mortal servant over a drop of wine. She paused, letting the words settle like frost. "How do you think that impacts the Eastern Accord when it comes to a vote tomorrow night?" The silence stretched. 5 seconds.
10.
An eternity in immortal time. Darius's smirk vanished. He sat forward slightly, watching Valerian with sudden, predatory interest. Valerian stared at Lena. He looked at her plain uniform, her tired eyes, her hands that still held steady despite the weight of 200 immortal gazes. He saw something there he hadn't seen in centuries. Not fear, recognition. Slowly, the fury drained from Valerian's face. He glanced down at the stain on his sleeve, then back at Lena. Something unreadable flickered across his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or something older. Then, to the shock of every soul in the Obsidian Hall, Lord Valerian Nocturne did something he had not done in 300 years of rule. He stood. Not in rage, not to strike. He stood in acknowledgement. And in the ancient language of vampire courts, standing before someone seated was an act of vulnerability, of respect. The hall gasped, a collective intake of breath that sounded like wind through a crypt. But Lena Cross did not sit down. She remained standing too, holding Valerian's gaze, because she knew something the rest of the court had forgotten. She knew the words she had spoken were not defiance. They were law. And the last time those words had been uttered in the night court, a king had lost his throne. The moment stretched like a wire pulled taut enough to sing. Valerian remained standing, a position no vampire king had willingly assumed in the presence of a mortal since the founding of the night court. Around them, the obsidian hall rippled with reaction like a stone dropped into still water. At table 3, Elder Kasha, ancient even by vampire standards, went rigid in her chair, her wine goblet frozen halfway to her lips. Her eyes, milky with age, but sharp with memory, locked onto Lena with something that looked like horror. Or recognition. At table 9, a young servant dropped a tray. The crash of silver against stone was deafening in the silence, but no one turned to look. Every eye remained fixed on the high table. And at Valerian's left, Darius Blackthorn leaned back in his chair and smiled. Not the mocking smirk from before. This was different. Slower. More dangerous. The smile of a predator who had just realized the prey had wandered into a trap. Valerian's mind was racing, replaying Lena's words with the precision of 3 centuries of political survival. Raise your voice again, and this is over. The phrasing was too specific, too measured. This wasn't the panicked threat of an angry servant. This was a formula, a legal invocation. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face. She wasn't trembling. I wasn't sweating. Her heartbeat, he could hear it, steady and controlled, betrayed no fear. Only focus. The kind of focus someone had when they knew exactly what they were doing. Where, Valerian said quietly, his voice carrying only to those at the high table. Did you learn those words? Lena met his gaze without flinching. They were taught to me, as they were taught to my grandmother, and to her mother before her. A sound like wind through a crypt whispered through the hall, though no windows were open. The flames in the chandeliers above flickered, their frozen fire dancing despite having no fuel to consume. Several nobles glanced up nervously. Valerian felt it then, a pull against his chest, subtle but unmistakable. The blood bond that connected him to every sworn member of his court strained, like a string pulled in a direction it had never been tested. Not breaking, but resisting. Impossible. Marcus, the chief advisor, had gone pale as moonlight. His hand clutched the edge of the table, so hard his knuckles showed bone-white beneath translucent skin. "My lord," he whispered, too low for mortal ears, but Valerian heard every syllable. The binding clause. She invoked the binding clause. "That's extinct," Valerian said, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were hope rather than certainty. "Clearly not," Darius murmured, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. His dark eyes gleamed with barely contained delight. How absolutely fascinating. At the far end of the hall, Elder Kasha rose slowly from her seat. The room felt even quieter, if such a thing were possible. When an elder moved during a feast, it meant something. She walked with measured steps toward the high table, her silver gown trailing behind her like mist. She stopped 3 paces from Lena and studied her with eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms. Then she spoke, her voice cracked with age, but carrying absolute authority. "She bears the mark of the voiceless covenant." The words hit the hall like a physical blow. Nobles gasped. Several younger vampires looked confused, but the older ones, those who remembered, went still as death itself. Valerian's jaw tightened. That covenant died 3 centuries ago. when I took the throne. The covenant does not die, Lord Nocturne, Elder Cassius said softly. It merely sleeps, waiting for the bloodline to return. She turned her gaze back to Lena. Show them, child. For the first time, something flickered across Lena's expression. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance of something inevitable. She reached up with her left hand and pulled back the collar of her uniform, revealing the hollow of her throat. There, just above her collarbone, was a mark so faint it might have been a shadow, except shadows didn't glow with a pale silver light when ancient magic stirred. It was the shape of a crescent moon bisected by a straight line. The old seal. The one that predated the night court itself. Valerian's breath caught. The first involuntary reaction he'd shown in decades. He knew that symbol. Every king knew it, even if they hoped never to see it again. The voiceless covenant. Humans sworn not to serve vampire courts, but to bind them. To act as living boundaries between rule and tyranny. Their purpose was simple and terrible. To remind kings that power without restraint was not sovereignty, it was monstrosity. The covenant came with a law so old it was woven into the magic that sustained the night court itself. A vampire king who raised his voice in anger against a sworn covenant-bearer forfeited moral authority over the throne. Not through violence, not through rebellion, simply by proving himself unworthy to rule with the restraint that kingship demanded. If Valerian had shouted again, if he'd given in to the rage that had been burning through him all night, the throne itself would have rejected him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, inevitably, as the blood bonds weakened and the court's foundation crumbled beneath his feet. You knew, Valerian said, his voice barely above a whisper. You knew what would happen. Lena's eyes held his, and for the first time, he saw past the calm exterior to the truth beneath. She had been terrified, was still terrified. But terror didn't matter when duty demanded sacrifice. Yes, she said simply. You expected to die tonight. It wasn't a question. Yes. The temperature in the hall dropped several degrees. Frost began to form at the edges of the windows. The ancient magic was waking fully now, responding to the invocation of laws that predated kingdoms. Valerian understood then. If he had shouted, if he had struck her, if he had done any of the things his rage had demanded, she would have died. But so would his reign. Everything he had built over 3 centuries would have fractured from within, and there would have been nothing he could do to stop it. She had been willing to die to stop him. To stop a king who had forgotten what restraint meant. Across the table, Darius Blackthorn's smile had transformed into something predatory and sharp. He was processing the implications faster than anyone else in the room. If Valerian's authority was in question, if the throne had been on the verge of rejecting him, then a coup wouldn't require armies or blood. It would require only patience. And witnesses. Well then, Darius said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. It seems Lord Valerian has a decision to make. He gestured lazily at Lena. Does he acknowledge the covenant? Or does he prove the covenant necessary? Every eye in the obsidian hall turned back to Valerian. The vampire king stood at the precipice of a choice that would define not just the night, but the next century of his reign. Dominance, the path he had walked for 300 years. The path of fear, control, and absolute authority. Or restraint, something he had not practiced in living memory. The admission that even a king could be bound by something greater than his own will. The flames in the chandeliers flickered again, waiting. The hall held its breath. And Valerian Nocturne realized that the most terrifying power in his kingdom had never been his crown. It was the voice of someone willing to die to remind him he was not a god. Valerian's mind moved through centuries in the span of a heartbeat. He remembered the night he took the throne, standing over the broken body of his predecessor, blood still wet on his hands, while the court watched in silence born of terror rather than respect. He remembered the rebellions he'd crushed, not with armies, but with a single cold glance that promised consequences worse than death. He remembered 200 years of enemies who united only in their fear of him, never in loyalty to him. Fear was efficient. Fear was controllable. Fear had kept the night court stable through wars, famines, and the collapse of neighboring kingdoms. But fear was also hollow. A foundation built on terror was strong only until someone stopped being afraid. He looked at Lena Cross, this mortal woman who stood before him with a mark on her throat and death in her eyes, and understood something that terrified him more than any rival's blade ever had. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. The hall waited for violence. They always waited for violence. It was the language Valerian had taught them to speak. Instead, he did something no king of the night court had done in recorded history. Valerian remained standing. Not in rage. Not in preparation to strike. He stood in acknowledgement of what Lena represented, a law older than his crown, a boundary he had forgotten existed. In vampire culture, a seated king was untouchable, elevated, divine. To rise from the throne was to descend to the level of those being addressed. It was a vulnerability made visible. A king stood only in the presence of equals, and vampire kings had no equals. Until now. The shock rippled through the obsidian hall like a physical wave. At table 7, a noble from the western houses gasped audibly, his hand clutching his chest as if wounded. At table 12, Lady Morvanna, a supporter of Valerian's rule for a century, looked away, her expression caught between offense and confusion. But at table 3, Elder Kasha nodded slowly, as if watching the fulfillment of a prophecy she'd long expected. Marcus, the chief advisor, looked like he might faint. "My lord, you don't have to." "Silence," Valerian said softly. The word carried absolute authority despite its volume. He turned his full attention to Lena. She remained standing as well, her posture straight despite the exhaustion he could see in the set of her shoulders. Silent equality. A mortal servant and an immortal king, facing each other across a divide that should have been impossible to cross. When Valerian spoke, his voice was measured, controlled, stripped of the rage that had dominated it moments before. It was the voice of a ruler who governed through intellect rather than intimidation. "You invoked the binding clause," he said, knowing the cost. "Yes, my lord." "Why?" The question wasn't rhetorical. He genuinely wanted to understand. "You could have fled, resigned, left the hall before this feast even began." For the first time, something like emotion flickered across Lena's face. Not fear. Something harder. More personal. "Because fleeing wouldn't have changed anything," she said quietly. "The covenant exists whether I speak it or not. The law exists whether you remember it or not." She paused. "And tyranny continues only as long as no one is willing to name it." The word hung in the air like a blade. Tyranny. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably. No one had dared speak that word in Valerian's presence in living memory. Darius Blackthorn laughed, a sharp, calculated sound designed to cut through the tension and redirect attention. "How touching," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The great Lord Valerian, brought low by a servant's sentiment. Tell me, your majesty," he emphasized the title with just enough sarcasm to make it sting, "will you be seeking the approval of the kitchen staff as well? Perhaps the stable hands should vote on matters of state." It was a test, an attempt to goad Valerian back into rage, to make restraint look like weakness before the entire court. Valerian didn't take the bait. He kept his eyes on Lena, his voice steady. "The covenant bearers were never servants," he said, loud enough for every vampire in the hall to hear. "They were boundaries, reminders that power without wisdom is not sovereignty, it's savagery." He paused, letting the words settle. "I forgot that distinction." The night court forgot that distinction. A murmur spread through the tables. Not of rebellion, but of consideration. Valerian was reframing the narrative in real time, transforming what looked like submission into wisdom, weakness into strength. Lady Morvanna, who had looked offended moments before, now watched with something approaching approval. Several younger nobles leaned forward, fascinated despite themselves. The balance of the court was shifting, not away from Valerian, but away from the fear-based foundation his rule had rested upon. And Darius Blackthorne, watching from his seat, felt the ground move beneath his carefully laid plans. His entire strategy had relied on Valerian's predictable rage, on the king's inability to show restraint, on fear eventually consuming itself. But restraint? Humility? A king who could admit error without losing authority. That was a threat Darius hadn't prepared for. That was a king who couldn't be toppled by simply waiting for him to destroy himself. Darius's smile faltered, just for a moment. But in a room full of immortals trained to read the smallest shifts in power, a moment was enough. The court saw it, the hesitation, the uncertainty, and they began to wonder if Lord Valerian could change after 3 centuries, who was truly rigid, who was truly trapped by the past, who was the real threat to the Night Court's future. Can you believe what just happened? A vampire king, 3 centuries old, just stood in acknowledgement of a mortal servant. If you're as stunned as the nobles in that hall, show me some love with a like. And if you're thinking, wait, how does Darius respond to this? Keep watching because what comes next will blow your mind. Don't go anywhere. Darius recovered quickly. Centuries of political maneuvering had taught him never to show weakness for long. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the obsidian table with calculated casualness, and addressed the hall rather than Valerian directly. Boundaries, he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone speaking uncomfortable truths. How enlightened. How progressive. He gestured broadly at the assembled nobles. But tell me, friends, when the southern houses refused to honor the blood accords last spring, did Lord Valerian negotiate boundaries? Or did he send Lord Marcus with a battalion to remind them what defiance costs? Murmurs rippled through the hall. Marcus went even paler, if such a thing were possible. When the trade routes through the eastern passes were threatened by human insurgents, Darius continued, his tone growing sharper. Did our king show restraint? Or did he burn 3 villages to ash as an example? The murmurs grew louder. Several nobles nodded, not in approval, but in recognition. These were facts, uncomfortable, undeniable facts about how Valerian had maintained power. Valerian's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak, didn't defend. The silence was more damning than any rebuttal. Darius smiled, sensing blood in the water. So forgive me if I find this sudden philosophy of restraint convenient. A king who ruled through fear for 3 centuries doesn't become enlightened because a servant recites old laws. He becomes desperate. It was a masterful attack, framing restraint as weakness, wisdom as desperation. Darius was offering the court a narrative that made sense, that Valerian's acknowledgement of Lena wasn't strength, but the first crack in an empire about to crumble. Several nobles exchanged glances. The younger ones looked uncertain. The older ones looked calculating. Then Lena spoke. Her voice was quiet, but in the charged silence, it cut through Darius's rhetoric like a blade through silk. Who controls the eastern passes now, Lord Blackthorne? Darius turned to her, his smile still in place, but his eyes cold. I'm sorry? The trade routes you mentioned, Lena continued, her tone conversational, as if genuinely curious. After Lord Valerian's response to the insurgency, who was granted administrative control over the reorganized territories? Darius's smile froze. You were, Lena answered her own question, along with a significant share of the tariff revenue. She tilted her head slightly. And the southern houses that refused the blood accords, when they were brought back into compliance, who negotiated the new terms? I did, Darius said slowly, as the king's chief negotiator for. And the revised terms, Lena interrupted gently, granted your family bloodline primary access to their coastal ports. Curious. She paused, letting the implication settle. It seems chaos has been quite profitable for you, my lord. The hall went very, very quiet. Valerian's eyes narrowed. He had known Darius was ambitious. Every rival was ambitious. But he hadn't connected the pattern. Hadn't seen how many of his own violent responses had ultimately benefited Blackthorne interests. Elder Kasha made a soft sound that might have been approval. At table 9, Lord Harrow, a neutral party who controlled significant mining operations, leaned back in his chair, reassessing everything he'd just heard. Darius's composure cracked. Just slightly. Are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything, Lena said, her voice still maddeningly calm. I'm observing that fear-based rule requires constant crisis to justify itself. And constant crises require someone to manage the aftermath. She met his gaze steadily. You've managed a great deal of aftermath, Lord Blackthorn. This is absurd, Darius snapped, his voice rising. He turned to Valerian. You're going to let a mortal servant accuse me, a lord of the Night Court, of manipulation? Of treason? She accused you of nothing, Valerian said quietly. She made observations, based on public record.
He paused.
Are her observations inaccurate? Darius's face flushed, not with embarrassment, but with rage barely contained. This is exactly what I warned you about, he said, his voice tight. Give ground to sentiment, and the entire structure collapses. Next, you'll be asking permission from humans to govern our own. Perhaps, Lena said softly, the structure deserves to collapse if it requires constant suffering to stay standing. The words landed like stones in still water. Darius turned on her, his composure finally shattering. You speak of suffering? You? His laugh was harsh, mocking. Your kind lives for 70 years if you're lucky. You have no comprehension of what it takes to maintain order across centuries. No understanding of the sacrifices required to profit from chaos? Lena asked. Her voice remained level, but her eyes were sharp as broken glass. To position yourself as indispensable while the kingdom bleeds? Yes, Lord Blackthorn. I understand perfectly. How dare you? Darius began, but Valerian raised his hand. Enough. The single word carried such weight that Darius fell silent, though fury burned in his eyes. Valerian looked between them, the rival who had smiled too soon, and the servant who had just exposed the architecture of manipulation that had been invisible for decades. Lord Blackthorn, Valerian said, his voice formal, cold. You have violated court neutrality. This feast was called under the banner of negotiation, and you have used it to pursue personal ambition. I've pursued nothing but the stability of. You've pursued your own interests, Valerian interrupted, while disguising them as concern for mine. The court murmured. Not with shock, with recognition. Once named, the pattern was obvious. The trade routes, the territories, the careful positioning after every crisis Valerian had created. Darius had been building an empire within the empire. And now, suddenly, every eye in the Obsidian Hall was on him. Not on Valerian's restraint. Not on Lena's defiance. On Darius Blackthorn's carefully hidden ambition, laid bare in the light of questions no one had thought to ask before. Darius felt the shift like a noose tightening. This wasn't how tonight was supposed to end. Valerian was supposed to rage, to break, to prove himself unfit. Instead, the king had listened, and the court had watched Darius reveal himself. The tension in the Obsidian Hall had reached a breaking point. The air itself felt compressed, as if the stone walls were holding their breath. Darius stood at the high table, his composure shattered, his ambitions exposed. Valerian remained standing, silent, processing the revelation that his greatest rival had been profiting from the very chaos his rule created. And Lena Cross, the mortal waitress who had stopped an empire with 7 words, felt the weight of what came next settle onto her shoulders like a shroud. You want proof the Covenant still holds power? She said quietly, addressing not Valerian or Darius, but the entire hall. You want evidence that these aren't just words spoken by a desperate servant? Elder Cash's ancient eyes widened. Child, you don't have to. Yes, Lena said. I do. She stepped back from the high table, moving to the center of the hall where the floor was inlaid with a circular pattern of white stone, so old and worn that most assumed it was merely decoration. But Lena knew better. Her grandmother had told her, had warned her. This was where oaths were spoken when the Night Court was young. Lena stood in the center of the circle and closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her voice rang out, clear, strong, carrying a cadence that felt older than the stones themselves. By blood spilled and blood sustained, she began, and the temperature in the hall plummeted. By the crown that rules the endless night. The chandeliers above flickered violently. Nobles gasped as frost spread across the surface of their wine goblets. By the throne that stands when tyranny falls. The obsidian table began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that could be felt in the bones. Valerian's hand instinctively went to the armrest of his throne, feeling it pulse like a living heartbeat. I speak the boundary. I name the line. Light erupted from beneath Lena's feet. The white stone circle blazed with silver fire, not consuming, but illuminating. Ancient sigils carved into the floor, hidden for centuries beneath dust and forgetting, suddenly became visible. They spiraled outward from where Lena stood, spreading across the black stone like veins of light. A king who raises voice in rage. Lena continued, her voice strengthening with each line, against the bearer of this sacred mark. The mark on her throat glowed brighter, visible now to every immortal in the room. Forfeits claim to moral throne. The walls themselves seemed to groan. Cracks of silver light appeared between the stones, tracing patterns that matched the sigils on the floor. And the kingdom's heart shell turned dark. The vibration intensified. Goblets rattled. Several nobles clutched the edges of their tables for stability. And in Valerian's mind, unbidden, came images. A king with eyes like coal, screaming at a young woman who bore the crescent mark, and the throne cracking beneath him as his court watched in horror. A queen, beautiful and cruel, raising her hand to strike a covenant bearer, and the blood bonds snapping like broken strings, her entire bloodline severed from the magic that sustained them. An ancient ruler, older than memory, roaring his defiance at the law itself, and the obsidian hall's foundations shaking until the chandeliers fell like stars, until the kingdom itself rejected him. Valerian staggered, gripping the edge of the table. These weren't his memories. They were the thrones. The accumulated weight of every king who had failed the test Lena had just given him. The covenant wasn't a metaphor. It wasn't symbolic. It was architecture. The foundation upon which the night court had been built. Remove it, and everything collapses. This oath binds not through force. Lena's voice continued, relentless, but through the choice each ruler makes. Darius tried to speak, tried to interrupt the ritual with some cutting remark, but no sound emerged from his throat. His eyes widened in shock as magic, ancient and absolute, sealed his voice. To govern with restraint, not rage. The throne itself began to glow, not with silver light like the sigils, but with deep crimson, the color of blood wine, of the bonds that connected king to kingdom, to rule by wisdom, not by fear. The light spread from the throne through the floor, following the blood bonds that connected Valerian to every vampire sworn to his service. They gasped collectively, feeling the connection strain and test, asking a question that hadn't been asked in 300 years. Is this king worthy? And should a king forget his place? Lena said, her voice dropping to something almost like sorrow. Should power blind him to his purpose? Valerian felt it, the throne's judgment pressing against his chest like a physical weight. Not crushing, questioning. Every act of violence, every burned village, every time he'd chosen fear over wisdom. Was this justice, or was this tyranny? The covenant shall speak once more. The hall was completely silent now except for Lena's voice and the thrumming of ancient magic. And the kingdom's heart shall know the truth. The light reached its peak, blinding, absolute. Every sigil blazed. Every blood bond sang with tension. The throne pulsed with crimson fire. Lena spoke the final line, and her voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed through the obsidian hall like the judgment of history itself. That kings are made by those they serve. The light exploded outward, not destructively, but absolutely. For one eternal moment, every vampire in the hall felt the full weight of the covenant's truth pressing against their consciousness. Felt the question being asked not just of Valerian, but of all of them. What kind of kingdom do you deserve? Then the light faded. The vibration stopped. The sigils dimmed but didn't disappear. They remained visible, glowing faintly, a permanent reminder of what had been awakened. Lena swayed slightly, exhausted by the invocation, but remained standing. And the throne, the physical seat of Valerian's power, continued to glow with deep crimson light, accepting, or preparing to reject. The entire night court held its breath, waiting to see which truth the kingdom would choose. The crimson light pulsing from the throne cast long shadows across Valerian's face. In 3 centuries of rule, he had never felt the weight of the crown quite like this, not as power, but as judgment. The throne was asking him a question, and the entire night court was waiting for his answer. Valerian looked at Lena Cross, still standing in the center of the ancient circle, exhausted but unbroken. He could kill her. The thought was there, cold and practical. One swift motion, and the covenant-bearer would be gone. Fear would reassert itself. The old order would remain. The throne pulsed brighter, the crimson deepening to the color of fresh blood. No, it seemed to say, that is the old answer. And the old answer has already failed. Valerian understood then, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins. Killing Lena wouldn't preserve his legitimacy. It would destroy it. The covenant had been invoked. The magic was awake. The question had been asked. If he chose violence now, if he chose fear over wisdom one more time, the throne would reject him. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The blood bonds would weaken. The foundation would crack. And everything he had built would crumble from within. But if he chose restraint, if he acknowledged what Lena represented, he would have to become a different kind of king. One he wasn't sure he knew how to be. The silence in the obsidian halls stretched unbearably. Nobles watched. Servants watched. Even Darius, his voice still sealed by ancient magic, watched with eyes that burned with anticipation. Valerian stepped away from the high table. He walked slowly, deliberately, until he stood at the edge of the white stone circle where Lena waited. The sigils glowed brighter as he approached, responding to the proximity of the crown and covenant. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the hall, measured, formal, stripped of the arrogance that had defined his rule. Lena Cross, he said, bearer of the voiceless covenant, keeper of the boundary between rule and tyranny. Lena met his gaze, her exhaustion visible, but her spine still straight. I acknowledge your authority, Valerian continued, not as a servant, not as a subject, but as the living law that predates my crown and will outlast it. The words felt like cutting away pieces of himself, like stripping off armor he'd worn so long he'd forgotten there was flesh beneath it. Then Valerian did what no vampire king had done in recorded history. He bowed his head, not deeply, not in submission, but in recognition, in respect. The gasp that swept through the hall was like a physical wind. At table 3, Elder Kasha closed her eyes, and something that might have been tears traced down her ancient face. At table 7, Lord Harrow stood abruptly, staring as if witnessing the impossible made manifest. The throne's crimson light blazed brilliantly, then settled into a steady, warm glow. Accepted. The blood bonds hummed through the hall, not strained but strengthened. Reinforced. The kingdom had its answer. And Darius Blackthorn, feeling his voice suddenly return as the magic released him, made the worst decision of his immortal life. This is pathetic, he snarled, his voice raw with contempt and fury. You bow to a mortal? You acknowledge human authority over the night court. He looked around at the assembled nobles, his face twisted with disbelief. Can't you see what this is? Weakness. Sentimentality. The beginning of the end. He turned back to Valerian, and all pretense of political calculation was gone. Only naked ambition remained. You're not fit to rule, Darius said. A king who bows is no king at all. The throne should be mine. I would never have violated covenant law. Elder Kasha's voice cut through Darius's rant like a blade. She stood, her frail body somehow commanding absolute attention. "Because that is what you have just done, Lord Blackthorn." Darius rose. "The covenant binds all members of the Night Court," Kasha continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "It forbids any noble from undermining a king's lawful acknowledgement of covenant authority. To do so is to place personal ambition above the kingdom's foundation." At table 12, Lady Morvanna stood. "She speaks truth. The law is clear." At table 9, Lord Harrow nodded grimly. "I witnessed it." He claimed the throne while the Covenant's judgment was still in effect. One by one, the elders and senior nobles rose. Not in support of Darius, but against him. The alliances he'd carefully built over decades, the relationships he'd cultivated, the debts he'd called in, all of it collapsed in the face of something older and more fundamental than political favor. He had revealed his ambition too soon, and in doing so, he had violated the very law that protected kings from internal betrayal. Valerian watched the court turn against his greatest rival without saying a word. He didn't need to. The covenant spoke for itself. "Darius Blackthorn," Valerian said quietly, and the hall fell silent again. "Under covenant law, witnessed by the assembled court, you are found guilty of violating sacred neutrality during judgment." He paused, letting the weight of centuries press into his words. "Your titles are stripped. Your blood bonds are severed. Your claim to any seat within the Night Court is forfeit." The magic responded instantly. Darius gasped as invisible threads snapped, the connections that bound him to the kingdom, to his house, to the power structure he'd spent centuries building. They broke one by one, and with each break, he felt himself becoming less. Not mortal, but unmoored. Cast adrift. "No," Darius whispered. "No, you can't. It's already done," Elder Cassius said, not unkindly. "The covenant has spoken. The throne has been judged." Darius looked around the hall wildly, searching for allies, for anyone who would stand with him. But every eye that met him looked away. He was no longer a rival. He was a condemned man. And everyone in the Obsidian Hall knew it. The Obsidian Hall, which moments ago had thrummed with ancient magic and judgment, now settled into a different kind of tension, the cold, precise atmosphere of political execution. Lord Harrow was the first to speak, his voice carrying the weight of documented facts rather than accusation. "The Eastern Pass territories," he said, pulling a folded parchment from inside his coat. "I have the original trade agreements here." Lord Blackthorn negotiated terms that granted his family bloodline exclusive mineral rights for 50 years, rights that were never disclosed to the full council. Lady Morvanna rose next, her expression carved from ice. "The Southern House's blood accords. I reviewed the terms last month when my own house was approached for a renegotiation. The debt structure funnels resources through Blackthorn Holdings before reaching the throne's treasury. I assumed it was incompetence." She paused. It wasn't. One by one, the nobles came forward. Not with dramatic revelations, but with ledgers, with contracts, with the accumulated evidence of decades of manipulation that had been invisible when viewed in isolation, but now laid bare in sequence, formed an undeniable pattern. Darius had been building his own kingdom within Valerian's. Slowly, methodically, profiting from every crisis while positioning himself as indispensable. Darius stood at the high table, his face ashen, the severed blood bonds leaving him visibly diminished. He was still immortal, still powerful, but the connection to the Night Court's foundation, the thing that made a vampire noble rather than merely dangerous, was gone. "This is," he began, but his voice cracked. "I serve the kingdom. Everything I did was to strengthen yourself," Elder Kasha finished quietly. She approached him with slow, measured steps. "You served yourself, Darius Blackthorn. And you disguised it as loyalty so skillfully that even I didn't see it clearly until tonight." She gestured to the evidence spread across multiple tables now, documents, testimonies, the architecture of betrayal made visible. "The covenant exposes more than kings," she said. It exposes all who place ambition above the kingdom's foundation. Valerian watched in silence. Part of him, the part that had ruled through fear for 3 centuries, wanted to feel triumph, to gloat, to make this fall as public and humiliating as possible. But restraint meant something different now. It meant witnessing consequences without adding cruelty to justice. Darius Blackthorne, Valerian said, his voice formal and devoid of emotion. The evidence is clear. The manipulation is documented. The violation of covenant law is witnessed. He paused, and for a moment their eyes met. Valerian saw something there he hadn't expected, not just rage or fear, but recognition. Darius finally understood. He'd been so focused on Valerian's weaknesses, so certain the king would destroy himself through rage, that he'd never considered his own vulnerability. Lena Cross had never been the threat. His own arrogance was. Under the laws of the Night Court, Valerian continued, you are hereby exiled. You will have until dawn to leave the kingdom's borders. After sunrise, your presence within any territory sworn to this throne will be considered an act of war. Exile. For a vampire, it was worse than death. Death was final, clean. Exile was endless. Cut off from the blood bonds that sustained noble houses, from the political structures that gave immortal life meaning, from the kingdom that had been home for centuries. It was becoming a wanderer in a world that had no place for the displaced and dishonored. Darius swayed slightly, the full weight of the sentence hitting him. Valerian, please. You plotted against this throne, Valerian said, and now his voice carried an edge, not of rage, but of absolute finality. You profited from the suffering you helped create. You violated sacred law while claiming to uphold it. He paused. There is no mercy for that. Only consequence. 2 guards stepped forward, not roughly, but with implacable purpose. They didn't touch Darius, but their presence was clear. Leave now, or be removed. Darius looked around the hall one final time, at the nobles who had once courted his favor, at the elders who had respected his counsel, at the kingdom he tried to steal through patience and manipulation. Then he looked at Lena Cross, still standing in the center of the ancient circle, and something like bitter understanding crossed his face. You knew, he said to her. Not an accusation, a realization. When you spoke those words to Valerian, you knew it would all unravel. Lena met his gaze steadily. I knew that kingdoms built on fear eventually consume themselves, she said quietly. And those who profit from fear are always the first to burn. Darius laughed, a short, broken sound. Then he turned and walked toward the hall's massive doors. His steps echoed in the silence. No one spoke. No one moved. When he reached the threshold, he paused without turning back. You think restraint makes you strong? He called out, his voice hollow. You think this changes anything? Fear kept the Night Court stable for centuries. Without it, you'll have chaos. Rebellion. The kingdom will tear itself apart. Perhaps, Valerian said quietly. Or perhaps we'll discover what a kingdom built on something other than fear can become. Darius said nothing more. He stepped through the doors, and they closed behind him with a sound like a tomb ceiling. The obsidian hall remained silent for a long moment. Then Elder Cassia spoke, her voice gentle but firm. What happens next, Lord Valerian, will define the next century of the Night Court. Darius is gone. The old order is broken. She looked at him with ancient, knowing eyes. The question now is, what will you build in its place? Valerian looked at the throne, still glowing faintly with crimson light. Then at Lena, exhausted and swaying but still standing. Then at the court, 200 immortals who had just witnessed the impossible. Power had shifted. The foundation had been shaken and rebuilt. But the cost of that transformation, what it would demand of him, of the kingdom, of everyone who had learned to survive under the old rules, that remained terrifyingly unclear. Darius Blackthorne exiled. His empire of manipulation destroyed. But here's the real question. What happens to Lena now? Does she stay? Does she leave? And what does Valerian do with a kingdom that's just learned fear isn't strength? If you're invested in finding out, make sure you're subscribed, because we're heading into the final chapters where everything comes together. Stay with me. The feast had ended hours ago. Nobles had dispersed to their chambers, carrying with them the weight of what they'd witnessed. The obsidian hall stood empty now except for the faint glow of sigils still visible in the floor, ancient marks that refused to fade back into obscurity. Valerian found Lena in the servants' corridor behind the kitchens, sitting on a wooden bench with her head tilted back against the stone wall. Her eyes were closed, her face drawn with exhaustion that went deeper than physical weariness. The mark on her throat had stopped glowing, but it remained visible, a silver scar against pale skin. "You should be resting in the guest chambers," Valerian said quietly. "Not here." Lena opened her eyes but didn't move. "The guest chambers are for nobles. I'm a waitress. You invoked a 300-year-old covenant and reshaped the Night Court's foundation." Valerian stepped closer, his voice dry. "I think that earns you better accommodations than a servant's bench." A ghost of a smile touched Lena's lips. "Does it? Or does it just make me a servant who forgot her place?" Valerian pulled over a second bench and sat, studying her. In the dim corridor light, without the drama of the hall and the weight of hundreds of watching eyes, she looked impossibly young. Fragile. Human in a way that made her survival feel like a miracle. "You knew you were going to die," he said. "Not a question." Lena nodded slowly. "When I spoke the warning." "Yes." She met his gaze. "The covenant demands sacrifice. That's the foundation of its power." "Explain." She took a breath, organizing thoughts that had been passed down through generations of her family like precious, terrible heirlooms. "The covenant works because of what it costs," she said. "A king who rules through fear can only be stopped by someone willing to face that fear absolutely. No escape, no safety, no guarantee of survival." She looked down at her hands, calloused from years of service, trembling slightly now. If I had spoken those words while planning to flee, while hoping for protection, while expecting reward, the magic wouldn't have answered. The throne wouldn't have listened. "Because the sacrifice must be real," Valerian said, understanding dawning like cold light. "Because power respects power," Lena corrected. "And the power to face death without flinching is the only power greater than a king's rage." She paused. "My grandmother told me, the covenant doesn't protect the bearer. It protects the kingdom, even if the bearer dies in the process." Valerian felt something twist in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in centuries. Guilt, perhaps. Or shame. This mortal woman had been willing to die to save a kingdom of immortals who had never even learned her name. "What kind of ruler have I been," he said quietly, "that it required someone's willingness to be destroyed to make me show restraint?" Lena looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but unflinching. "You've been a kind of ruler who forgot that fear and respect are not the same thing. That power and authority are not the same thing." She paused. "But you remembered tonight. That's what matters." "Because you forced me to." "Because you chose to," Lena countered. "I gave you the warning. The magic gave you the consequence. But you made the choice to stand, to listen, to bow." She held his gaze. "You could have killed me and dealt with the aftermath. Many kings would have." Valerian was silent for a moment, thinking of the visions the throne had shown him. Kings who had made exactly that choice. Who had chosen fear over wisdom and watched their kingdoms crumble. "I want to offer you something," he said finally. "Title. Land. Protection. A seat on the council." He leaned forward, earnest in a way he hadn't been in living memory. "You reshaped the Night Court tonight. You deserve recognition. Reward." Lena shook her head slowly. "I don't want any of that." "Then what do you want?" "Restore the covenant," Lena said simply. "Officially. Not as forgotten history, but as active law. Train other bearers. Make sure that when I'm gone, the boundary remains." She met his eyes. "Make sure no king ever forgets again that power without restraint is tyranny." Valerian studied her, This woman who had held his entire kingdom hostage with 7 words and now asked for nothing for herself. "You won't stay," he said, understanding. "Even with status. Even with protection. You'll leave." "I was never meant to stay," Lena said. "The covenant bearers serve by existing, not by ruling. If I took power, if I took titles, I'd become part of the structure I'm supposed to hold accountable." She smiled faintly. "Besides, I have rent due in 3 days." Despite everything, Valerian laughed, a short, genuine sound that surprised him. "I can pay your rent, at least." "You can pay every servant in this hall a living wage," Lena countered. "You can make sure no one has to work 3 double shifts just to survive." Her voice was soft but steel-edged. "That's the kind of kingdom worth building." Valerian nodded slowly. "It will be difficult. Centuries of structure to reshape. Nobles who resist. Systems that rely on fear," Lena finished. "I know. But you don't have to do it alone anymore. You have elders who remember the old laws. Nobles who want something better. And now," she gestured at the faint glow of sigils visible even in the corridor's dim light, "you have the covenant holding you accountable." She stood, straightening her uniform with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "Where will you go?" Valerian asked. Lena smiled, tired but real. "Back to the outer city. Back to normal life." She paused at the corridor entrance. "But I'll be watching, Lord Valerian. The covenant is awake now. And if you forget what tonight taught you, you'll be back," he finished. "Someone will," Lena said. "That's the point of a boundary. It doesn't disappear just because you stop seeing it." She turned to leave, and Valerian realized he was watching the most dangerous person in his kingdom walk away. Not dangerous because of strength or immortality or political power. Dangerous because she had proven that some things mattered more than survival. And that kind of conviction could reshape worlds. Dawn broke over the Obsidian Hall 3 days after the feast that changed everything. Valerian stood before the assembled court, not the full 200 who had witnessed Darius's fall, but the council of elders and house lords who would carry his decisions into every corner of the Night Court's territories. The throne behind him still bore a faint crimson glow, a reminder that the Covenant's magic had not returned to sleep. I watched it, waiting, holding him accountable. "Effective immediately," Valerian announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, but none of the rage that had once defined it. "The voiceless covenant is reinstated as active law within the Night Court. Covenant bearers will be identified, trained, and granted protected status. Any noble who raises voice or hand against a bearer forfeits their blood bonds and faces exile." Murmurs rippled through the council chamber. Not of rebellion, but of adjustment. This precedent is being shattered and rebuilt in real time. Elder Kasha nodded approval. Lord Harrow looked thoughtful. Lady Morvanna, who had supported Valerian's acknowledgement of Lena, sat straighter, vindicated. Furthermore, Valerian continued, and this was the part he knew would meet resistance. All mortal servants within Night Court territories will receive living wages sufficient to sustain themselves without requiring multiple shifts or supplementary employment. Working conditions will be reviewed by a council that includes servant representatives. Lord Petrov, who controlled significant agricultural holdings worked primarily by human labor, bristled. "My lord, the economic impact is manageable," Valerian interrupted calmly, "if we prioritize sustainability over maximum extraction. The old model profited from desperation. The new model will profit from stability." He met Petrov's gaze without blinking. "Unless you're suggesting your holdings can only function through exploitation?" Petrov fell silent. Around the chamber, other nobles who might have objected reconsidered. This was not a king asking permission. This was a king who had learned the difference between power and authority and was wielding the latter with surgical precision. "Trade routes currently controlled by displaced Blackthorn interests will be redistributed," Valerian went on. "Profits will flow toward infrastructure, roads, safe houses for travelers, protection from bandits, rather than private accumulation." More murmurs. These were not small changes. This was the reshaping of centuries of economic structure. The blood accords with the southern houses will be renegotiated in good faith, with terms that benefit mutual prosperity rather than punitive compliance. Valerian paused, letting each reform land before moving to the next. And finally, a formal inquiry will investigate every crisis of the past 50 years to determine which were genuine threats and which were manufactured for political gain. That last one sent a chill through certain members of the council. How many minor houses had profited from instability the way Darius had? How many had been complicit without realizing the larger pattern? The Night Court was being forced to confront not just one ambitious rival, but an entire system that had rewarded manipulation over integrity. These reforms begin today, Valerian said. Not next month. Not after debate. Today. His voice softened slightly, but lost none of its authority. The Covenant has reminded us what we forgot, that a kingdom exists to serve those who live within it, not the other way around. Elder Kasha rose slowly, her ancient frame somehow majestic in its fragility. Lord Valerian speaks with the wisdom the throne demands, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. I support these reforms without reservation. One by one, the other elders stood in agreement. Then the House Lords, some immediately, others after careful consideration. Within minutes, the entire council was standing, not in submission, but in cautious, genuine hope. The Night Court was changing, and for the first time in living memory, that change felt like possibility rather than threat. Far from the political chambers and ceremonial declarations, Lena crosswalked through the outer city's narrow streets as the sun climbed higher. She wore the same plain dress she'd arrived in, carried the same worn bag. The coin Valerian had insisted she accept, not as payment, but as acknowledgement, rested heavy in her pocket. Enough to cover 6 months of rent. Enough to breathe. She passed a notice board where a new proclamation had been posted overnight. By order of Lord Valerian Nocturne, all mortal servants are granted protected status and living compensation. A small crowd had gathered, reading the words with expressions that ranged from disbelief to fragile hope. An older woman clutched her companion's arm, tears streaming down her weathered face. Lena didn't stop, didn't announce herself. She had never wanted to be part of history, only to ensure history moved in the right direction. By the time she reached the city's edge, the stories had already begun. In a tavern near the eastern gate, a merchant told his companions about a feast where a waitress had stopped a king with 7 words. The details were already shifting, becoming myth. Some said she'd been 10 feet tall, others that she'd wielded ancient magic like a weapon. In the servants' quarters of a minor noble's estate, a young man who'd worked the feast whispered to his colleagues that he'd seen it himself, a mortal woman standing equal to the vampire king, and the king had bowed. In the outer villages where Lena's grandmother had told her the old stories, people began to remember. The covenant, the boundary, the law that made kings accountable. And in households across the Night Court's territories, servants who had learned to make themselves invisible began, slowly, carefully, to lift their heads. 6 months later, in a banquet hall 300 miles from the Obsidian Hall, a young vampire lord raised his voice at a servant who had spilled wine during a delicate negotiation. The servant, a man named Thomas, who had heard the stories, did not cower. He set down his tray with deliberate calm, met the lord's eyes, and said quietly, "My lord, the covenant is law. I respectfully remind you that volume does not equal authority." The hall went silent. The lord's hand, raised to strike, slowly lowered. "You're right," he said after a long moment, and the surprise in his own voice was evident. "My apologies. The spill was an accident." Thomas bowed slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and continued his service. At the high table, an older noble who had been present that night in the Obsidian Hall smiled quietly into her wine. In the Obsidian Hall itself, Valerian sat on the throne that had tested him and found him worthy. The crimson glow had faded to a barely perceptible pulse, no longer judgment, but partnership. The covenant was satisfied. For now. A servant approached with a question about the evening's preparations. She spoke clearly, without fear, and Valerian listened, truly listened, to her concerns before making his decision. When she left, Elder Kasha, who had been reviewing documents nearby, looked up with something like satisfaction. "The kingdom learns quickly," she observed. "The kingdom was always capable of learning," Valerian replied. "It just needed a reason to." He thought of Lena Cross somewhere in the outer city, living a life history would never record. No monuments would bear her name. No songs would recount her deeds with accuracy. But every time a servant spoke without fear, every time a noble chose restraint over rage, every time someone in power listened instead of commanded, she would be there. Not in person, but in principle. The boundary between rule and tyranny, held in place by those willing to die to maintain it. Valerian had ruled for 3 centuries through fear and built an empire that required constant violence to sustain. Now, he was learning to rule through something far more difficult, the kind of authority that never needed to shout. Because real power, he had finally learned, wasn't measured in volume or fear or the ability to make others submit. Real power was the strength to stand when challenged, to listen when angry, and to acknowledge that even a king could be bound by something greater than his crown. Real power was restraint, and restraint, unlike fear, built kingdoms that lasted. The obsidian hall chandeliers flickered gently in a wind that came from nowhere, and the ancient sigils on the floor glowed just bright enough to be seen, a reminder that some laws were older than thrones, and some voices could never be truly silenced. Once, a king had raised his voice, and everything almost ended. But he learned to listen, and everything began again. And that's how a waitress changed a kingdom with 7 words. If this story moved you, if Lena's courage inspired you, if Valerian's transformation gave you hope, hit that like button and subscribe because I have more stories like this coming your way. Stories about unlikely heroes, impossible choices, and the kind of power that doesn't need to shout. Tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Lena's position? Would you have spoken those words knowing you might not survive the night? I want to hear from you. And I'll see you tomorrow with another story you absolutely cannot miss. Until then, remember, real power is restraint. And sometimes the quietest voices echo the loudest.